Hello, everyone, and welcome to our community book club for August of 2022. My name is Alex J. Lore. My pronouns are he, him, and I'll be moderating this discussion tonight. We have our panelists here, as well as Bryan Young, the author of Honors Gauntlet, who won the Diamond Quill Award at last Quills, that's Quills 2021. And yeah, since we're here as a panel, I'm going to have everybody introduce themselves first. If non-panelists can please keep their cameras off and themselves muted and drop any questions that they have for the panel or about the book in general in the chat. That way I can moderate it. That would be great. And yeah, my first question for you all, since I want everybody to introduce themselves, is to please introduce yourselves and talk to us a little bit about how you came to read Bryan's book. And for Bryan, how did you come to write this book? I always want the origin story. So yeah. Terra, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm Terra Luft, she, her. I'm the membership chair of the League of Utah Writers. And I came to this book because my friend Bryan said I would like it. And I am probably one of the non-target audience because I'd never read anything. I'm not a gamer, so I didn't have any kind of experience to tie into it. I just read a book that my friend had published that I wanted to support him.
Cool, thanks. Cass.
Hey, I'm Cass, he, him. Yeah, I mean, sort of similar story. I've been, following Bryan's work for years, and I think I've read probably, if not all, 90%-ish of everything that he's written or published. So, yeah, and this one was a lot of fun. I also was sort of uninitiated, was only sort of tangentially familiar with Battletech, and really enjoyed this book.
I'm gonna quickly add my 2 cents before I hop to Bryan, but I too, apparently this is the theme that we're all new to Battletech because I hadn't come across it before. And honestly, I used to think I'm not a big military sci-fi reader, but then I kind of went through my backlist and realized, oh, actually I am, but I think my backlist of military sci-fi that I've read, which I kind of count Battletech as a part of just because of how the genre tie-in works, definitely kind of fits into that. So it kind of as I was reading it and looking at tropes and things, I was like, oh yeah, there are a lot of things that are commonalities. Bryan.
Yeah, so just to introduce myself, my name's Bryan Young. I use he, they pronouns, and I'm the author of Battletech Honors Gauntlet. This was my first book in the Battletech universe, and I was really grateful that the League of Utah Writers and the judges of the contest awarded it the Diamond Quill last year, and I'm really excited to talk to you all about it. As far as how I got the gig, actually, so I had been doing a lot of writing in general, in other genres and things, and had been going to conferences with a mutual friend of mine who is Mike Stackpole, who he's written a ton of Battletech novels and a ton of Star Wars novels and everything like that. And basically what happened is he had introduced me to the folks at Catalyst Game Labs who run the Battletech license. And they had talked to me about my interest in writing Battletech. Well, first I had asked about whether they'd be interested or not in me being able to write Shadowrun, actually. So Shadowrun was it's another property they use. It's very much like cyberpunk with Tolkien's fantasy races. And that was much more where my interests as a kid lie. But with Battletech, there was a Super Nintendo game I was super into. My friends and I had played the networked computer games a ton in high school. So I was super familiar with the universe, but I didn't realize the backlog of fiction. And so they gave me a reading list and had me start reading in the universe because they were Shadowrun's kind of full. but we need Battletech folks. Would you be interested in that? And I said, yeah. So I started reading and really got into the universe. And they were like, we want you to write some stories over here in this era. And so I read a whole bunch of stuff and produced a whole bunch of pitches in that era. And then as soon as they got to this close to approving those pitches, they were like, hey, that's cool, but we're actually switching gears on the timeline and we are going into a different era. So could you catch up on some other stuff? And the direction I got was like, you're going to have to check out Mercenaries, like read all the mercenary based stuff you can. So there was, in Battletech, there's a whole bunch of different eras. So there's like, the era that we were coming out of was the Dark Age. And that was when WizKids owned the property. And I don't know if you remember WizKids, but like they made HeroClix. And they also made a Battletech click game the same way. It was called Mech Warrior. And WizKids, when they took over the license, just wanted to kind of like literally nuke the timeline on everything and start up 100 years later or whatever and start the Dark Age, making communication in the universe very slow and sort of bombing all of the factions back into the Stone Age. And now when I got involved, Catalyst was finally starting to say, we're going to move into this new era. And so check out Mercenaries. As they were having their roadmap discussion about all of this, they had a summit in Seattle where Catalyst is based, and Mike Stackpole was there. And I knew they were having the summit. I knew that there was going to be stuff they wanted me to do. But after the summit, I got a call from Mike Stackpole, and he said, so the good news is I put you on the schedule for 3 books. I knew you could handle them. I'm really excited for you to do it. And I was like, okay, you said the good news. What's the bad news? And he's like, well, I put you first on the list. You've got a book due in 2 months. And do you know anything about the Jade Falcons? And I was like, well, no one has actually ever said that I should read into the Jade Falcons. I was working on Mercenaries. So I had a couple of months to get up to speed on the clans, which feature prominently in this book, and to get my outlines approved so I could start writing. And so, yeah, that's how I got into writing this book. It was networking at conferences and then having the faith of Mike Stackpole and my writing ability and quality and speed to be able to turn this in on time, because this book, this is something like there's literally 100 Battletech books that came before this. And so I had the challenge of stepping into that world and creating something new, but also creating something that could lead into the events that would happen later in the story, like later with other writers and other books. It's a very long-winded answer, but that's the origin story.
That's why we have you here. I'm like, that actually perfectly ties into my second question, which is for, I guess, all of you that are newbies to this, is what was it like to come to this as a newbie? Were there any challenges that you noticed or any things that worked particularly well for you all being new to this? And then for Bryan, I want to know a little bit more about like continuum and where that fits into the universe, but I'll ask that in a minute.
I'm going to go first, Cass. So I, like you, Alex, really love the military science fiction sort of in any genre, right? I love military, I love sci-fi, I love military sci-fi. And so for me, it felt like I was coming into something that I knew that there was a lot of people who had written in it. I had no idea until I just heard from you, Bryan, that there was 100 books before it. That the breadth of all of this is kind of intimidating in like hindsight, right? But when I started reading it, I really liked how the very beginning gave us basically like here's what you've missed in a summation. And the way that it was just, it felt like, I remember when I read it, it felt like sort of like a cross between Pacific Rim, which I love as far as like a movie franchise, and also some of the other like science fiction, like space opera-y, but also super military heavy. So it was just interesting and fun to read, and I didn't feel lost at all, which I was worried about, because I remember when Bryan was telling us, hey, you guys should read this book, and please, will you buy my book? You know, like we all do as authors with each other, right? But I was like, I don't know anything about Battletech. I'm not a gamer. Am I going to get lost? And Bryan assured me that I wouldn't. And surprisingly, I didn't. So it was nice to read. It was just a fun little adventure.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, I had similar concerns, like, oh, there's this sort of really deep, rich universe that I'm jumping, into really late in the game, and concerns over being able to sort of follow that. But one of the things I was really impressed with, Bryan, was your ability to sort of fold in really natural explanations, or provide, terminology in context that made sense, and made it so that you didn't spend a lot of time going like, I don't know what any of this means. There were, I actually just reread it over the last couple of days, and there were a couple of things that I remember going like, I'm not 100%, have my head wrapped around this, but never in a bad way. Always in like I want to read more of this universe so that I can understand what's happening here, or what's going to happen here. So yeah, all of the concerns that I had in terms of jumping into the universe, being sort of unfamiliar, ended up not being concerns at all.
Yeah, I'm just gonna kind of chime in as panelist here too. I was kind of having the same concerns, because when you get into a franchise like this, and I had heard of Battletech before, but I just was like, that is not a gaming franchise I have any like sort of background in. I kind of vaguely remember the Super Nintendo game, sort of, but like from a background back in Germany, and I feel like everything was like different then. But I really liked, like, again, how Cass said, how you folded things in and explained things just enough for us to have that context. So I guess my question for you, Bryan, is like, what was that like as an author to do that? What were some challenging things with that? And also, like, it kind of like reminded me of how the Star Wars franchise does a lot of this, where you have like so many entry points into this universe, and I feel like, do a really great job at adding just enough exposition. Like, was that something that influenced you, or is that just conjecture on my part?
So I'll tell you, there's two things that influenced me really specifically. One, when I started working on the fiction, or when they started, they gave me a reading list. The first place I went actually was Mike Stackpole, and I said, hey, what book should I read to get up to speed? Because the editors hadn't given me a reading list yet. And Mike said, the only books you need to read are mine. Don't worry about anybody else. And I started reading Mike's first book chronologically, and I was like, none of this makes any sense. Like, I can't do it. So I went back and I specifically read the first 3 books that had ever been published in Battletech, and I kind of saw the building blocks of the universe and how it worked. So that was definitely, that experience reading Mike's books was something that I thought pretty deeply about when I was embarking on this, where I kind of felt like I was in over my head. The other thing is, I had a conversation with the writer Max Allan Collins. Now, Max Allan Collins has done a lot of like, he's been finishing a lot of Mickey Spillane's work. He's sort of the guy who's in charge of Mickey Spillane. He wrote the graphic novel Road to Perdition that turned into the movie. He wrote all kinds of Batman comics. And we were having a conversation about his Batman comics, and he said that his philosophy was that every comic book was going to be some fan, some person who was going to get into comic books for the rest of their life. Every comic book was going to be someone's first. And you didn't want to weigh them down with anything. Like, if they pick up Batman number 476 or whatever, you don't want them to feel like they're going to be lost. You want to be able to give them just enough context so that they can pick up literally any issue, have it be their first, and move on from there. And he said that back when he was writing these comics, there were people like, it was at the same era, like Frank Miller was writing his, so like you had Batman Year One or Dark Knight Returns or whatever. He was writing these little 1 episode, sort of 1 issue, one-offs. And everybody said, like, why are you doing that? And he kind of explained that. And then I don't know if you remember like the DC superpowers like action figure line. Right after Marvel had done the Secret Wars line, there were these DC comics that were sort of an equivalent, and they started packaging them with comics. The toy company went through and looked at all the comics and said, which ones would make sense to package with the stories? And they were all Max Allan Collins books because they were all really accessible to new readers. And that story really resonated with me. And so I wanted to make sure that if someone picked up a Battletech book and they pick up one of my Battletech books, it can be absolutely an entry point into the universe because it could very well be there first, which was the case with all of you. I think the same holds true with my second Battletech book and the other stories I've written in the Battletech universe. Was really trying to make it so that if this was the first Battletech book someone picked up, they wouldn't be lost or feel left behind or feel like they didn't get the whole story if they didn't want to continue in the series. Not all of the writers have that philosophy. Not all the books I've read have had that philosophy, but that's definitely the way I approach it. So if you're looking to get into it, I feel like my goal was very much to try to make it so that you could start with any one of my stories and you wouldn't have a problem.
Cool. I'm going to ask Jim's question in the chat because I feel like it's relevant right now. But I mean, you mentioned obviously a good entry point for everybody is your books, but he would like to know if you want to start out reading the series, like getting started on the 100 books, where would you start?
So I think a really good place to start would be that first trilogy. That first trilogy is the Grey Death Legion trilogy, and it's about a young man who sort of builds his own mercenary unit from the beginning. And the authors really did put together the building blocks of what they are. And then I would move forward to Mike Stackpole's Blood of Kerensky trilogy, which is what introduces the clans for the first time. And then, I mean, you could just kind of hop around. If you feel like the mercenary stuff is the stuff that's your jam, there's places to find just the mercenary stuff. If there's places where you feel like the clans are your thing, there's going to be books that really feed into that. If you like, I mean, there are books that feel very much Game of Thrones, right? In the early days of the universe, they had these great houses that were all sort of vying for power and jockeying over it during the wars that went on. And there are books that very much have that vibe too. So really, it would be, if you want to start, think about what your tastes in sci-fi, military sci-fi specifically are, and then sort of just ask Battletech fans where to start that's going to help you scratch that particular itch after you read my books.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. And I want to know, what was everybody's favorite part of Honor's Gauntlet specifically? I'm gonna pick on Cass first because Terra likes to go first.
Yeah, the thing that I enjoyed the most about the story was I think, you know, a different author might have taken the same sort of events or the same setup and done something totally different with it. I think the main character, the character of Archer Pride, could have been a very sort of, you know, generic clan member who kind of towed the line, and you still could have done the, you know, the battles and all of that and had maybe a good Battletech book. But what I loved about it was that he exists in this world that's sort of built on a foundation of like brutality and carnage, and he's found a way, success, you know, whether you think it's successful or not, to exist and succeed and advance in this world while still maintaining his own like inner sort of morality and philosophy, and that balance I found to be really interesting.
I did too, and I would add that I really liked how there was emotional relevance to it. So if I don't necessarily love the battle parts, I could follow the battle parts, but there was also the connection of the characters to each other. And it wasn't just about the battles. I really liked hearing and feeling how they cared about each other within the clan, and especially within the Jade Falcons, and also how the characters interacted within and without from their little group. That was probably my favorite part of it.
Yeah, I think like the way that there contrasts in the character relationships too. Like I feel like that's what it always comes down for me. Like in military sci-fi that follows like certain tropes and conventions, I'm all about like, because really it's like a found family story, like when it comes down to it. But you also have this whole like how Archer Pride and Malthus like constantly go back and forth in that whole conversation that they have about like, so if I told you to jump, would you? And it's like, yes, and then it becomes the okay, yes, but, and we kind of start like kind of eroding some of the things that are so like intrinsic, right, to like military command structure. Is like, okay, but would it be worth it? Like, what are the consequences? Like, all of a sudden we get these questions like trickled in. I feel like in terms of favorite part, it's probably that one for me. Bryan, for you, what was your favorite part writing it?
That scene was one I was really excited about. Actually, when they sent me the audiobook, that was the scene I was most excited to hear how the book narrator like took care of it, because I think there is something really exciting about that scene. The inspiration for that scene also is like one of my favorite scenes in a movie, and it was Orson Welles in The Third Man when he takes Joseph Cotton's character to the top of the Ferris wheel to tell him, to try to explain his half of the morality. Like he'd been a member of the underground, the black market. He was selling like bad penicillin on the black market that was killing people. And he has this moment where he says, look at all those little dots down there. If I told you you could have $10,000 for each one, would you talk to me about morality, or would you start counting how many of those little dots that could stop moving that you could actually afford? And I really liked trying to figure out how to apply something like that into the clan culture and how that could work. And like, yeah, like these clan warriors are supposed to just follow orders no matter what, but you know, why do they need to follow the orders if they don't have a greater purpose behind them? And that was something that Archer really pushed back against. Archer as a character was somebody that really interested me as well. And I'll tell you something I haven't really talked about. I patterned Archer. So Archer got his name actually in the last draft, right before we went to print. His name throughout the entire first 4 or 5 drafts was actually Diego Bailey. And if you notice all of the Spanish and the name of Tornado, and it's got a lot of Zorro to it, I had sort of patterned him after Guy Williams as Zorro, the mustache and everything. And then at the last minute, they were like, hey, in Battletech, they did a Kickstarter a while ago, and they had people were able to like submit characters and names and like give dossiers on the characters. And they're like, so there's this character who sounds pretty much exactly like Diego Bailey, but his name is Archer Pride. Could you just change the name? And I was like, yeah. And so literally my last draft was finding and replacing all of the Diego Baileys, because, you know, Diego de la Vega was Zorro and stuff. I had to replace all those with Archer Pride. And then as part of my draft, try to fit into that Pride sort of legacy, because there were a whole bunch of books that had other characters of the Pride bloodline in them that I had to add some little connections to those and sort of change it at the last minute. But writing him as a character, this sort of iconoclastic person who is working within the clans but trying to sort of push them in a different direction, made a lot of sense, because the Jade Falcons have been the heavies. They've been the mustache twirling villains for the last 20 years of the fiction. And having someone that was more relatable for a group of, you know, psychopathic warmongers was really interesting to me. And so that was really, really fun for me to write.
That's really cool. And that actually, again, like leads into my question, like just for you, Bryan, like what is it like to, like, I'm going to ask a couple more tie-in questions later, but what's the process like to write something like this that literally is like a part of a series of 100 books? Like they're games, they're like all of these things out. What does the writing process for something like this look like? Like how much of it is story brainstorming and like story execution, but also like making sure it fits into contingency, like continuance stuff, making sure it makes sense in the wider universe. Like, how much fact checking did you have to do? And yeah, were there more curveballs like this where you had to suddenly change a character name and things like that?
So in this, we had a very, very shortened timeline, and I'd never actually published anything in Battletech before. So it was very much a tryout for me on their part as anything. So I had an idea, and Mike Stackpole and I talked it out and kind of worked out like the story point I had to hit was that the Jade Falcons were abandoning worlds in their occupation zone to head to Terra, right? And I could play inside those confines however I wanted to. And Stackpole and I had a really long conversation about how to make that as interesting as possible. And I really hit upon the idea of the iconoclastic Jade Falcon who follows orders that seem to make sense, but will buck against those that don't. And how the planet's politics would work, because there's something that, like, in a lot of the other Battletech books I've read in the era, there isn't a lot of, like, the way the clan structure works as far as an occupying force doesn't feel like it would work, right? The philosophy, and you see that back and forth with me trying to explore how that would work. Like, how do you occupy a place and basically enslave the population and make them feel okay about it, especially in these pockets where there's like 10 Jade Falcons on a planet of 5 million or 10 million or a billion or whatever. How do you keep control and how do you keep them happy? And so Archer Pride was really about the interest in the story for me was really about, like, how would that work for someone who doesn't necessarily want to run it like that and actually sees value in how to make life better, or if not better, but at least not bad for the lower castes in the system. So that was sort of the jumping off point. And I had to write a synopsis about how I thought the book would work. And I turned that in and I got approval on it. And then they asked me to do an outline. And so I had to do a chapter by chapter breakdown where I wrote every chapter. And the book was originally only supposed to tap out at 40,000 words. And I wrote a chapter breakdown that doesn't actually include Malthus's point of view at all. And I turned that chapter breakdown in and I said, hey, if you give me more than 40,000 words, I think what I'm going to need is another point of view character to sell the story. And it's going to need to be Malthus. And we're going to add another 15 to 20,000 words to the story. And they were like, no, just write it like this. We like your outline, hit the 40,000 words. So I turn it in. And the first editor that went through it was like, you know what you really need? You need like 15 or 20,000 more words, and you need this other point of view character. And I was like, yes, thank you. And so I finally got the approval from the editors to go through and do that. So my second draft added in all of those scenes with Malthus, not the scenes with Malthus, but the point of view scenes from Malthus's point of view. And we worked on the ending and stuff. And then after that was done, after the story was solid, then it went to the fact checking team, and they told me, like, how I got mech combat wrong, or which weapons I wasn't using, or why that mech I picked was the wrong one for the situation. And they were really great in helping guide me through that. And then along with changing Diego's name to Archer Pride in that last draft, that was also when they told me which planets it was. So they told me to write the story the way I wanted to write it, and they would figure out later what planets it took place on, because the Battletech universe is it's mapped out. That you can't just, in Star Wars, they'll just be like, make up a planet. No one cares. Just make up a planet, tell us the general area where it's at, you're good to go. Because it doesn't conflict with continuity. Battletech is very like, there's a hard sci-fi element about like how long it takes to travel from planet to planet. There's a hard sci-fi element about like how the travel works and what the planets are. And so you can't really mess around with that as one of the writers. You can't just make up a planet. So those were the sorts of things where they were like, okay, here's the planets we chose for you. And then you'd go to the encyclopedia entries about the planets and you're like, oh crap, this planet is frigid, or this planet is this or whatever. So you've got to change all of the weather and the stuff in the environment and things like that. So it was challenging, but in a fun way, where every iteration of the story made the story better, and every iteration of fact check made it more accurate so that people wouldn't like buck against it. It got to be a little bit easier process with my next book, where they were like, okay, he can do that. And I've written a bunch of novellas and short stories in the interim between that and my new book that just came out. And so for that book, all I had to turn over was the synopsis. Like I turned over the synopsis and they were like, cool, just right. So it varies. And the fact check on that was a lot easier too. And I also knew what questions to ask fact check while I was writing instead of waiting till the end. So it was a much easier process, even though it was twice as long of a book.
So it sounds like a lot of this is definitely a like audition of not only like your writing skills, but also how well can you work with these different editorial passes, since it's like very much like, oh, like here's your world edit and you're like like literal battle mechanics edit and so on, like making sure that you're like a good fit for that sort of team seems to be like part of that process as well. Cool.
Very much so.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I'm always like, how does anyone keep all of this in their head? Like, probably the answer is no. You have a team for that. That's awesome. That's kind of reassuring, honestly. Because yeah. So I want to kind of come back to like Bryan, you just touched a little bit on like the whole idea of all the ethical questions that are coming up in this book, because we're essentially like following a main character that's like, he thinks he's one of the good guys, but like they're occupiers and enslavers. And it's like, yeah, like there's some questions with that. So I'm just kind of curious, like what some of everyone's favorite like ethical dilemmas were in the book and what you thought about how it was handled.
I want to go first because it's been a long while, and so I can't dig deep since I read this one. I remember the ethics between Malphus, is that how you say her name, and Archer, and the dynamics of them both being on the side of we're occupiers, and her wanting him to be so much more ruthless, and him like in his own way rebelling against that. That was my favorite part that I remember.
Cool. Cass?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned before, I liked the conflict that Archer was dealing with, but I think you're right, Alex, that he's relatable because he's like the least evil bad guy. But there were certainly moments in the book, like early on, right toward the beginning, when they sort of go and have that skirmish on oh gosh, it was one of those names that I just sort of like mumbled over when I read it. Yeah.
What Bryan said.
And they quell this sort of uprising, and then he has this moment where they have almost sort of a tribunal, I guess. And I thought that maybe he was gonna like have mercy on the people there, because that was sort of the way that he was sold. And then they just behead like a bunch of people on camera, and so it was a little bit like you liked him because he didn't just sort of automatically toe the line, but then at the same time, like when push came to shove, he was like, well, I will murder people if I have to.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
that came about really like examining The Godfather, right? In The Godfather, you root for the Corleones, not because they're good people, but because they're the most human of all the bad people. And so like, that was really the approach I had to take, where I was like, I'm dealing with a whole bunch of evil people, and I need to make people who are actually really reasonable, like the governor and things like that are just like fighting for their people, seem sinister, or that they could be opposed to him in the same way you might have like judges or politicians dealing with Michael Corleone. And it was so much about making him the most easy to root for amongst all the horrible people that it was really like, that was the goal exactly And it was like looking at like, oh, these are all bad people and they're running numbers and rackets and prostitution and all of this stuff in The Godfather, and they're terrible people, but they draw the line at drugs and they are really into their family. And it's like, oh, okay, I can root for these people. They have a line somewhere. And that was what I was trying to do with Archer.
Well, yeah, and I think it was successful because I had to think for a while just now about like, what was there anything? Because there is that moment at the beginning where I was sort of like, ugh, I don't know about this guy, but like the moment Malthus shows up, it's like I forgot. Like he just murdered a bunch of people, and now I'm 100% on Team Archer for the rest of the book.
Because you have someone who shows up who's just even worse.
Who's worse, yeah.
Super worse. Tara, you unmuted. Did you have a comment?
I was gonna also add to that. At the end also, you again forget all of that bad shit because he's so good to his people and he's so protective of them, and it does play on that whole Godfather and the family and protecting the family. I really liked that part too.
Yeah. I don't know. I bring up as like someone coming from a German background, I always have to think about like whenever I see any sort of fiction or media piece that like humanizes basically someone who is like demonstrating a lack of humanity, but then also you're like, okay, but also it depends, right? Everybody has that line. Like it makes me think of this German movie, The Downfall, which is all about like the last 3 days in Hitler's bunker and the controversy that ensued about this movie actually in Germany, because Bruno Ganz, who plays Hitler in this movie, like portrays him as a human being, and this whole like way how we as an audience or as readers or as someone who know these things right from history books, we know as readers genocide is bad, like publicly executing people, you're probably not a great person, and yet like we kind of come to face with this idea that, oh, but these people are still human. Like it kind of sets something off in us as humans to go like, ooh, okay, how do I feel about this? Like, can I trust my own feelings regarding that, or is it actually ultimately beneficial to do that because are people getting more out of it? That was actually my question for Bryan too, is what do you want readers to get out of this book? What do you want them to take away from it?
Well, I want them to have fun first and foremost, but the other thing is I really want people to look at power structures that they exist in and to find out where your personal line is and know where to draw it, and to be able to push back against that and be able to say no when someone wants you to do something that you are adamant is wrong. And I think that's what Archer does through the book. He has a very different line than I would have, but in a universe that's 1,000 years in the future or 1,100 years in the future, and where like these sorts of like, you know, military fight, like this sort of culture is something that yeah, we don't advocate for murdering people. This sort of culture is commonplace for the setting. I think that I hope that people get the idea that they can in their own lives apply that, like, I need to know when to say enough is enough and this is wrong, no matter the strength of that power structure.
Yeah, and like no matter how deep you're in it either, right? Because here you have like not just someone who is like because I feel like we see so many narratives that have like your classic like revolutionary or even like a reluctant revolutionary, and it's like, yeah, but like it's easy or it's easier to stand up for something if you aren't like super deep in the system. Like it's like I think it's really interesting to look at a character like this that is like clearly like invested in this and clearly like believes in this, but also like kind of develops like his own moral code within that, where it kind of becomes more like shades of gray.
Well, and I think part of that is like you see the other parts of the power structure disdainful of his interest in like learning local customs or languages. His assimilation into these cultures and reading and learning about those things are what caused that spark of empathy with him, or that line. and moved him that way. And so like you see the things that people frown upon, like reading, learning the local customs, speaking Spanish, like those are things that led him to be able to draw the line there. And like I hope people can draw those connections between that and the people in this world who would try to get you to be like, no, we need to ban this book or that book or whatever, and we don't want these things, and everyone needs to speak only X language or Y language or whatever. And that was definitely something that was on my mind as I was writing.
Yeah, I love that
I also
extra layer.
loved that because as a reader, I took away that even though this is total sci-fi futuristic fantasy world, right? There is that common denominator that ties it all together. And it is our humanity and being able to see that it isn't ever black and white. There is just gray. It's really hard to find a solidly black or white sort of, it's always this way or it's not this way, you know. It's the binary is very not ever in our world. So I really love
No such thing as a binary.
But I
Yes.
laughed like every time the binary comes up because that's so like intrinsic in the Battletech world. I'm like, it doesn't exist, but also like it does. Like,
Yeah.
like I kind of love that part, and I don't know if that was intentional or not, but just makes me snort as a non-binary person whenever someone's like the binary. I'm like,
Yep. The play on the words of the binary because even in the way that the world is set up, that's one of their like military terminology, right? And every time that played on words, I thought that in my mind as a reader as well. So I love that part.
Yeah, it's really cool. Okay, I want to talk about characters. And Bryan, I want you to talk about Easter eggs here in a second. But what were everybody's favorite characters? Because we talk about character relationships a lot, but did any of you have like favorites, like other than, was it Archer? Was it someone else that you really liked or really liked to dislike?
I mean, I think like Archer's the easy answer. I liked sort of the whole main cast of characters, Archer, Callan, Vincent. I think outside of those sort of main players, the person that I maybe liked the most and sort of found myself like cheering for was the Minister of Agriculture. I just thought that she had like, toward the end, I don't know how far into spoiler territory we want to go, but toward the end, when they're sort of
Go
packing
spoilers.
up, what's that?
Go spoilers. I'll actually ask you all about the end.
Okay, yeah. So toward the end, when they're sort of packing up and leaving the planet, and there's that interaction between the Minister of Agriculture and Malthus, like you knew that she knew that she wasn't going to walk away from that, and that she still stood up and sort of, raised the figurative middle finger before she went down. And so I found her, and even the more subtle rebellions sort of during the dinner party, and the way that she sort of moved resources around to be like, oh, we don't have anything to give you. Like, I liked that she found a way, sort of the same way we've been talking about Archer, that she found a way within the system that she lived in to try and push against what was expected and do what she thought was right, even at the expense of her own life.
Cass stole my answer.
Oh,
so
rude.
I know. Well, but the other one that I loved was the one that shared my name, but I know we're going to get to that later.
Yeah, because I wanted to
That
know.
was-
Yeah,
That was pretty cool.
I feel like, I don't know, like for me, like within the clan, it definitely was Kellen, who I think like was like kind of like that character who really gets us to like buy into how this is working because of how her relationship with Archer is, how her relationship with the rest of her group is, and all of that. Like you kind of need to have this character who is like the one that you kind of want to protect. I feel like where you're like, okay, yeah, you're in a bad system, but I would like you personally, like in terms of character sympathy. That was definitely my character. But yeah,
I have another answer that you just made me think of. Aaliyah, and specifically the moment toward the end when they're sort of trying to get back to the ship, and Archer's telling her, like, you got to take off, like, don't wait for us. And she's like, gotcha, copy. And he's like, why are you standing outside the ship,
Why are
like
you
firing
still
on them?
here?
Why are you not on the platform? And she's like, I heard you. Okay, yep. And just sort of, tongue in cheek, like I will verbally saying, like, I'll carry out your order, but then not doing it made me really like her.
Yeah, this was really fun. It's like, yep. Again, I feel like those characters that play within the system, but also kind of know how to like use it for their own purposes or when to break the rules. Those are really fun. Bryan, I want you to talk to us about the Easter eggs of all of the characters that share names with certain people in the league. Like, what inspired that? And I also always wonder, because like I feel like military sci-fi is like a good ground to like name people after people. Like what was the inspiration here and how did that go? Were there any issues with just going like, you know what, I'm gonna name these people after people I know, or was that pretty free game?
So there was two sort of tracks that I had to name people for. As part of that Kickstarter, there were definitely characters that in my first 3, 4, 5 drafts were literally named Kickstarter 1 through 12, right? Where I knew that I had to put them in from the Kickstarter. And so I'd have to create a spreadsheet on the side to spreadsheet on the side to say Kickstarter 1 is such and such sort of character. They're in this faction and here's their rank, whatever. And then they would tell me what the characters were. And then I'd have to conform their gender to what the Kickstarter thing was and stuff like that. And I try to use those for like minor characters that generally wouldn't take a lot of work to do that, or would be able to pop up in small ways here or there. But then other times, like, you can only do that so much, like without going out of your mind working on a manuscript. So you just have to go through a lot of names. And I don't think people realize, even in a short book like this, how many bloody characters there are to name. I mean, you think about a binary of mechs. A binary of mechs, for those who don't know, is 2 stars of 5 mechs, plus your command structure, plus everybody else, plus everyone they interact with, plus any text they might be dealing with. So it's like, you're talking about like 30 names right off the top, right? So if I'm doing 12 to 15 names from Kickstarter, I got to come up with 12 to 15 of my own. And so sometimes it's like, literally, I'll just go through my Facebook and go like, what name would work? Like, I'll go through my Facebook feed and just see who pops up and see if I can connect a character to that as I'm going to name one. Other times I'll go through the League of Utah Writers Discord and go like, oh, I can name this person after this or that or whatever. And that's where you all ended up in there. So like Alex Carnelian, the Minister of Agriculture, came from Alex. And then there's a mech warrior named Terra, and another one I think is named Ward in there. The league president at the time was Johnny Worthen, and that was where I got Governor Worthen. And if you read it knowing Johnny, you know I was describing Johnny in a suit.
I was dying. Also the whiskey, but also I was like, he would never. Okay, but yes, it was Johnny.
I mean, the character wasn't Johnny, but the physical appearance was. It makes it easier when you have to draw these characters. And I don't want to say they're throwaway characters, but they have to fulfill a story role. When you take some aspect of them, right? Or if you take some idea of them and put them in that way. So there's a lot of those. And sometimes like they don't always work out, right? So like Callan was actually another writer in our writing group. And they were in all the early drafts as Aaron. And the editor was like, you've got too many A names. One of them has to go. And I was like, I don't know which one to lose. I really liked Aaliyah, but I didn't. I mean, it was Diego to start with, so I had his 2 lieutenants as A names, and that was it. But I had to change. Now that I had Archer and Aaliyah, I had to get rid of one of the other A names, and Aaron's middle name is Callan, so it was just like I dropped Callan in there. Things like that, because like I have to spend so much time like focusing on the story and the characters themselves. I don't necessarily need to spend too many power cycles working on names when there's that many. But I did try to pick names in places that would give some impressions right off the bat, or had sounds that could sounds or feelings that could help with the story symbolically, like Worthen, right? Like there's some worth there. Or I liked having a mech warrior named Terra in this group that was at the end of the story heading to that battle on Terra. You know, things like that. Like when there can be some of that extra layer, I'll gravitate toward that.
Yeah, I was trying to definitely play like, ooh, wait, whose last name do I know? It's like Osman. I saw Chantel in there. I saw various League members in there. Stackpole isn't in there, I'm assuming, because you wrote.
I've tried to get Stackpole into Battletech so many times. I tried to get him in as a whiskey, and they keep taking it out. So I got to come up with a different way to get Stackpole in there somewhere.
That would be the perfect homage. I mean, if you know Stackpole, it's like, yes. I feel like that's also like a really, really fun part. It's really funny because you're actually, your book is the second military fiction or science fiction that I'm in. In my first one, I am some sort of battle cruiser captain, and I go down in an explosion. Like I was actually asked, so if I use your name, how do you want to go down? And I'm like, explode me. So I like how you were just like, we're gonna go with what these names sound like. So that was really cool. That's awesome.
That means you've been exploded twice.
Like explode me all the time.
No. She was.
That's right. She
Alex
was like
Carnelian.
kicked.
She was obliterated and kicked. Like she got boiled alive, and
that's right.
She got kicked and then lasered.
Other people got exploded with lasers.
I mean, lasers though, can they also be part of explosions? Kind of. I don't know. That's maybe a past question. But yeah, that made me very happy. I'm like, yes, I get to go down epically in both of them. But yeah. Oh, I was going to ask, was I going to ask this? Oh, I already did ask you this. Oh, I was going to ask everybody what you thought about the ending, since we're talking about how people are going out. Did that pay off for you? And did you like how it teased what's coming next? And for Bryan, I want to know, how do you work a book like this into making sure it fits where it fits, and teasing just enough for the next book or whatever is coming next? And is that going to come up in your next books, or is that for someone else to tackle?
Go ahead.
I love the ending. I think that the sort of back and forth of the two POVs between Archer and Malthus works really well for a couple of reasons. One, you can see these sort of two different types of battles happening at the same time, but also you get to experience their sort of interplay and arguing back and forth from both perspectives. So I thought that was really fun. It was sort of implied that that Malthus's ship was destroyed and that she died, but I'm skeptical. And then the reveal at the end, I thought I actually was really impressed with that. I think because, as I mentioned before, one of the things you did really skillfully was weave into the story hey, here's the Cliff's notes of everything that's happened before, and obviously the big thing is we're all trying to get back and overtake or take back Terra, our sort of ancestral homeland. And so building that in sort of subtly in a way that almost felt like, hey, this is just background, so you kind of know what the stakes are, and then having this sort of last minute reveal of oh, BT dub, here we are, it's this thing that's been building for 1,000 years is happening right now. It's the last page of the book was pretty satisfying.
Same. And I also loved that at the very end, because they had done the thing that they'd come to do, but you left us with the if we keep doing what we've been doing, we're gonna all die off, and that we have to change. The Jade Falcons have to change to be able to survive. That was also a layer of that setup that made it really satisfying for me, because when it all said and done, it can't just be battle after battle after battle. You have to be able to show that things are at stake and that they have to change to maintain what they're after. So I love the ending personally. Very satisfying.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, Brian, I always like, as someone who really struggles with endings, I'm wondering like how, like, I'm assuming like it seems like you really had the ending in mind, like giving how, like, especially the epilogue works out, how we're getting teased at, like, here's what the next battle is going to be. But what's that like as someone who's writing tie-in fiction who might not necessarily get to write this battle? How did you kind of like position your story and decide how to position your story, and like make it so that either you or someone else could like pick up basically what you're laying down with this?
So it had to work on two levels, right? The first level is like, I knew there was a book coming out by an author named Blaine Lee Pardoe that was called Hour of the Wolf, and that would be the battle for Terra. That would be Clan Wolf and Clan Jade Falcon going at it with literally everything they had to first take over Terra and then fight each other to find out who had the right to claim themselves as the Ill Clan. And I knew that was coming, but the general audiences in Battletech didn't, right? So this was actually the first reveal that we were going to get something closer to that battle, because this is something that's been talked about in the fiction for 20 some odd years, and we've never gotten any closer to it. And so I needed to make it, that was the challenge of the book. When they said, we need something where it's like the Falcons are picking up, like they're picking up and they're leaving for Terra, and they're leaving sort of this wastelands of planets behind as they're heading to Terra. And when we started spitballing the story, I had to ask the editors, like, does the audience, I know a general audience wouldn't know that. Like, I assumed you all wouldn't guess that we were heading to Terra at the end of the story. But I wanted to know how much the average Battletech reader might know. And those were questions that we had to ask back and forth as editor writer in that relationship to figure out how we build that and tease out another writer's book in a way that was going to be satisfying and cause that excitement. And as I was writing, I knew that that was the moment I was writing to, because I wanted audiences who hadn't been following the fiction and know that, like, that trilogy where the clan comes in and they come back from space and they fight their way toward Terra and they get stopped on 2K id by Comstar, like, they've been trying to get back to Terra for the last 100 years, which has been the last 30 years of fiction. And I wanted people who didn't have all that context to have that same, like, oh crap kind of feeling that Battletech readers would experience. And so I was trying to layer it in at both times, which is why there are all those conversations about Terra. Like, if I were worried about just a Battletech audience, I wouldn't have put all those hints and things in, so the ending would have an impact to Battletech readers, but maybe not non-Battletech readers. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with Max Allan Collins and stuff. But I also knew that, like, I couldn't get, I had to read Hour of the Wolf on my own after it came out, because I didn't get there wasn't a copy ready. I think it went through a whole bunch of rewrites, so I wasn't able to get a copy that would be useful for me for my next book until after it was released. And I was reading it greedily to try to figure out if Archer Pride lives, so I knew if I could do something with him after, right? And spoiler alert, like, you're right, the Jade Falcons didn't change. They got their asses kicked at Terra. They lost, and they were essentially, they were absorbed into Clan Wolf essentially, as sort of their loyal bodyguards. Spoiler for that book. But I had to know that I couldn't be precious about it. Like, if Archer Pride died in that battle, I'd have to be okay with that. But fortunately, I still have him as a tool to use moving forward. And then with my next book, I felt a lot more comfortable in the situation because I was part of laying the groundwork for everything and saw how the other writers built that groundwork in a really great way for me. So like the first chapter in like my last chapter in Honor's Gauntlet actually ends on Terra. The first chapter of my next book starts on Terra after the battle, and it involves Jade Falcons through the rest of the story too. So actually you could read these two and if you wanted to skip Hour of the Wolf entirely, if you wanted to or needed to, and just read these two and get the totality of that story. So it's just a balancing act and learning how to not get precious about the toys that I'm creating for the universe, because other people can and will use them, and they might not do it in the ways that I want, or they might do it in exactly the way I want, and I get excited to bring those toys back in, like Archer. I think that answers your question.
I was actually going to ask about that too, where a question of survival fits in, which I feel like you kind of answered, but if you want to talk about that a little bit more, you can. But I'm wondering, like, since this is also a book club for writers, do you have any tips for writers on how to not get precious about their characters? Because I feel like that's where most of us like get really invested, right? Is we're building these characters and we get really attached, and it's like, are there like specific things you do or specific things you're not doing in order to kind of maintain a little bit more neutrality? Is that just what comes with the territory of writing tie-in fiction, and it's just like, get over it? Like,
so
write your own fan fiction? I don't know.
So I think part of it is like, it's work for hire, right? I'm being hired by a company to fulfill certain things, and even though I'm going to use characters that are mine, that are my creation, I am fully aware that other people might use them. For the most part, though, those interactions with those characters are like up to the writers, and the editors will say, hey, do this. When I was writing A Question of Survival, they handed me another book that could have tied into A Question of Survival and said, hey, is there any way you could make any of these characters cameo? Which is what happened with Blaine and Honor's Gauntlet and Archer Pride in Hour of the Wolf. The editors handed him Honor's Gauntlet and said, hey, this is where this book winds up. Can you read it and see if you can insert that character into the narrative? And the writers are really respectful about like using the toys as given and not necessarily breaking them. It was Blaine's other book, No Substitute for Victory, I read because it was also other Jade Falcons that had been left behind in the move to Terra. And I read it and had tried to come up with a couple ways to incorporate those characters, but it happened too late on the timeline, and so I couldn't do anything with them. Other times, like in Shrapnel, I have a series of novellas that they actually all won awards, actually, at the League of Utah Writers typewriters, that starts a new mercenary unit called the Fox Patrol. And I don't think the editors would let anybody use them without my sort of sign off or blessing or whatever, because I'm actively telling more stories in that world. So like, there's definitely like, I've been working on some stuff with Mike Stackpole where we're collaborating on some Battletech stuff and plotting out a thread of the future. And there's definitely some factions that he sort of established 30 years ago or 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago. And other writers have kind of run them into different directions over the course of this 120, 150 year history. And, you know, there's definitely some things as we're going through going like, we'd have done it differently, or we'd have done this differently, but the toys are still on the table and we just have to figure out the best way to play with them. So I think it's not a matter of getting precious about them. It's a matter of looking at the toys, seeing them for what they are, and then using them appropriately in the highest, best way that you can, and to have fun doing it. And know that, you know, you might hand one of those toys off to somebody in the sandbox and they might snap it in half, and, you know, be mature enough to share.
Yeah, I think that's super important too. I love the whole like networking aspect of tie-in fiction as well, where it's like you can really kind of like build on things and like cooperate, I think. in interesting collaborative settings with that. That's really cool. I kind of want to talk about zoom maybe out a little bit with my next question and ask what to you all are some tropes that good military fiction or science fiction really needs and thrives on. Oh yeah, by the way, if any of you have questions that you want to drop in the chat, go ahead and do that. I will totally bring them up. I'm Donovan, I'm actually going to bring your question up after this one. Since I kind of want to get into military sci-fi in general. What are some tropes that you all think are kind of must-haves, and how do we see them in Honor's Gauntlet? And I also want to know what some things are that you would like to see or like to see more of. And this is for everybody, including Bryan, because I feel like that's also a question that when you're writing in that genre is always something that's a driving force. Terra, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think my favorite tropes of all of the military that I read are the things that I already said I loved about reading this one, are like the character relationships. And I think, Alex, you said it, it's a lot of times it's like a found family. And that trope of, we're in it because we almost die together, so we're living together and developing those relationships. I also love the rebelliousness of, yes, I have to follow orders, but sometimes my leaders aren't so great, which also was in this book as well. Those are probably the two of my favorite ones. And then I also love the whole spy conspiracy, like what's really happening trope kind of thing when I read. So those are my favorites personally.
I don't know that I can speak to tropes. I don't think that I actually read a whole lot of military sci-fi. I think my relationship with the genre is like this book and Starship Troopers or something. So I don't know that I can speak to tropes and what should be there. I can tell you what if I were going to spend more time with the genre, what I would like to see is a lot of what I saw in this book, which is, I think that when you have stories that are sort of built on a foundation of the military, there's maybe a danger in leaning too heavily into toxicity. And as you mentioned, Alex, humanizing people who are doing terrible things. And so I think if you can build a story in that sort of framework and then use it as a way to push against those sorts of behaviors or tendencies, I think that is maybe, to my mind, the most interesting thing you could do with that sort of setting.
Bryan?
I think one of the ones I love the most is that, no, your orders are stupid, I'm not following them. I think one of my favorite instances of that is a scene that Elias Koteas and Nick Nolte have in The Thin Red Line. And there's a scene where Nick Nolte's I don't care what the situation is, you need to take your men up there. And he's you don't understand the situation. My men are all going to die if we do that. And he's no. You have to go, you have to follow my orders. And, Elias Koteas's character was a lawyer in a past life and sort of argues by the book for it. And you'll see some echoes of that scene specifically in Honor's Gauntlet, between Malthus and Pride. But that sort of thing, I really love bucking authority in those military sci-fi. And like Tara said too, that found family stuff is stuff that I really dig in that way. I don't know. What about you, Alex?
Yeah, I'm kind of really curious about things where the genre is headed. As someone who as I was looking at wait, what military sci-fi do I read? And honestly, it's usually the very queer kind that leads very into roles and relationships and expressions that we don't quote unquote normally see, right? One of my favorite entry points actually was Tanya Huff's work. Don't remember why the first title of her I think it's the Honor trilogy, but it's basically her being the staff sergeant over her squad and having to basically constantly be the parental figure to her squad and like figuring this out. And but all of the relationships in there are so non like they're not toxic relationships. Like they actually like constantly kind of undermine these questions. Similarly, like KB Wager's work, that's very like leaning on that whole idea of like found family. And yes, there's a command structure, but like, can we use this for good? Like, I kind of love the juxtaposition of military sci-fi, and instead of like leaning into like the military industrial complex and like occupation and colonialism in space, like instead make it like more of a hopeful thing where it's more like it's less, hey, can we put our way of living push through and put that on other people, and rather look at it more from like a Star Trek perspective of let's explore this and see what happens, and can we please all be friends? Like, I don't know, like that's my favorite, where it's like, yeah, you still need the military structure, but it's not all about the battles, or the battles don't necessarily look the same way. So that's something that I like both love that's now more of a thing. And Bryan in Honors Gauntlet, I really liked how like it really felt like most of the officers that we come across are women. I'm like, yes, more of that, please. Like that's definitely something I want to see. But yeah, that was definitely one of my favorite things. I also was wondering, like, as a writer in Battletech, like, were there any things where you came across things that people told you like, nope, like you're going too far with things?
So there was one I wanted to have. Callan was originally non-binary, and I wasn't as familiar with the clans, but the clans are very rigidly into eugenics and gender binary. And so they were like, there are other cultures you can have non-binary and trans characters in, but like the clans, it doesn't make sense with how their eugenics and how they deal with all that stuff works. And so that was something that like I was told I shouldn't do there. Mm-hmm. But I've since gotten other trans and non-binary characters in Battletech and other places. Mm-hmm. So that was definitely something there where it was just like I didn't understand it enough and the culture enough the way editorial sees it to have gotten that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely, because I was definitely also looking at that going like, wait, like, because I knew who some of the names were based off of, and I was like, oh, okay, it's probably because of this. I mean, given that they operate in binaries, like that I think makes sense for the world building too. And it's like, if you were to all of a sudden put a non-binary character into like the clan structure, like it really would have to, like, I don't know, like this is maybe my point of view, but it almost would have to be about like, what is it like to function as a non-binary person in that, which, yeah, would have to definitely be like, that's a whole different type of story, really.
Yeah.
Like that, I definitely get that. I'm going to bring up Donovan's question here. He's asking, as a writer of Battletech sci-fi, do you think having a background in military service helps you write? Or does the world building of Battletech have it pretty much well established in its writer's Bible?
So I think the answer is probably both. I don't have a history of military service, but I have a lot of friends who do. And where possible, I will ask them questions about their expertise and their experience with that, and read a lot of nonfiction and listen to a lot of nonfiction about that firsthand military experience that were I to have joined the military, I think I would have just sort of in my head, rather than how I've just soaked it in from other sources. But I definitely think that there are writers who do lean on that military service, and that stuff probably comes a lot easier for them, and they don't have to reach out as often as I might do, because I've got lots of friends who've served in the military, and lots of friends who are actively serving in the military that I rely on for those military questions as often as I'll rely on the Battletech fact check folks. And if I were more of an expert at it firsthand, I would probably have to do that less, which would speed up my writing time. So I do think it helps, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary, because Battletech does have a pretty well established way that each military faction, whether that's the clans or mercenaries or whatever, functions. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And Connor is asking, for the future timeline in Battletech, do you think it's very likely the periphery states will expand or become more relevant in sequels?
I am not going to talk about the future timeline because I know things and I'm planning things. And as we get into Alaric Ward's Star League with the Ill Clan, there's definitely going to be a lot of things changing.
Cool.
And so
NDA spoiler, like
I don't feel like I can answer that satisfactorily, like in a way that would be great for you or for me, like working on it. And besides, so much of like there are things that are pretty well established that are happening, right? Like when I wrote A Question of Survival, which is I think it has the most recent events in the universe. Those events were planned a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And part of the reason this book was supposed to come out, A Question of Survival was supposed to come out in September, but we hurried it and released it in July because they wanted it out in time for Gen Con, because it spoils some of the events in a source book called Dominions Divided, which is so like, the planning is a couple of years ahead, but there's so much in flux beyond that. So yeah, I'm not going to say anything. Sorry. I wish I could answer your question.
That is fair. That's also why like tie-in and work for hire NDAs exist. Like
yeah, you always joke, like the Star Wars writers always joke that like Lucasfilm has snipers. I don't think Battletech has snipers, they have LRMs.
Yeah.
And they would just destroy me. Or
and
Gauss
other ones,
rifles.
because now we know things that we're not supposed to know.
Yeah.
Use my cat's butt. I actually want to ask real quick about a question for survival, since it like just came out. It's kind of like the next book. I feel like you kind of already told us like where in the timeline the story fits. Is there anything else that you want to tell us about this book and like why people might want to read it?
So yeah, A Question of Survival is really, it delves into the Jade Falcons again, but a different sect of Jade Falcons than we've really seen. Somebody who's more like Archer than Nikita Malthus. And he is very much picking up the pieces. When Malvina Hazen sort of picked everything up. Malvina is a very brief character in Honor's Gauntlet, but she's the Khan of the Jade Falcons and picks up everything and moves to Terra and doesn't leave anybody behind. And so the Jade Falcons that are left, there's only one of them left with a blood name, and he just sort of assumes command as the new Khan of the Jade Falcons, not because they don't know if anyone survived on Terra. They don't know if there's any Falcons there left. So his dilemma is a question of survival. I did not believe in Malvina Hazen's doctrines, and I want the Jade Falcons to survive. How do we do that? How do we change? How do we adapt to do that? On the other hand, I got to explore Clan Ghost Bear, which is a much different society. This is Clan Ghost Bear. When they came to the Inner Sphere, they incorporated into the Racelheg Republic, which was a very democracy-minded area. And it sort of turned into what they called the Racelheg Dominion. And so the Ghost Bears sort of integrated into their military. And they became citizens. And the other castes aren't treated as castes or members of lower castes or anything the way that works in the Jade Falcons. They're all equal. They're all equal in each other's eyes in that way, where they still answer to a civilian government. The prince in charge of the Dominion happens to have been trained as a Ghost Bear in the military, but sort of left that to lead the government. And they're left with a very sharp choice because of the way they've integrated, and because Clan Wolf has taken Terra as the Ill Clan now and wants to create the new Star League Defense Force. They have to decide whether they're going to join up. it can't be a unilateral decision from the clans, because that's like the way it was described to me when I was first initially sort of pitched this idea was like, imagine the United States needing to go and make a decision on some unified government, and you sent the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Would they be able to make that decision without going to the elected officials to do that? And that's how the Ghost Bear cons function. And so there's this parallel story of how the Ghost Bears grapple with the choice of joining Clan Wolf, which by rights of their culture has dominion over them. And at the same time, there is these war games happening with a number of Sibcos. I don't think we talked much about sibling companies, the training groups that the clans have, but these Sibcos that are ready to graduate all end up on this one planet to have these war games and sort of train right before they graduate. And the Jade Falcons hear word of this, and in clan culture, you can call for a trial of possession and just show up and be like, dude, I'll totally duel you, and whoever wins gets this. And he goes and shows up and says, we'll do this duel, but if I win, I get to take all these kids. And it plays out over that, because it's these two factions trying to figure out how to function and how to survive in the new status quo.
Yeah, that's really cool. I really like this. Oh, Jim also wants to know, he says he's curious if Bryan has read the Dorsal series because it has some similar arcs to what is described as part of the Battletech arc.
I have not, but I will put that on my list.
Yeah. It's going to actually like ask everybody to finish, like as we are closing out this book club. I first off would like to invite everybody to share with us where else we can find you and your work online. But I also want to know, since this is a book club, what are you all currently reading or are really excited to read? Anyone want to start? Da-da.
I'll start, sure.
Okay.
So I'm always reading a handful of books at the same time, but the book that I've been reading privately on my own is the Dennis E. Taylor's Bobaverse series. It's a sci-fi series that involves like artificially intelligent like space probes that can clone themselves, and it's a lot of fun. And then sort of the family book we've been reading at night as we've been going through the Silmarillion, because I'm the only one in the house who's read it, and just sort of getting in that headspace for the Amazon series coming out. In terms of where you can find me, I'm on Twitter at CassidyWard.com, or at Cassidy Ward. My website's CassidyWard.com. And you can find my nonfiction writings on sci-fi.com and /gear.com.
I just finished a book that I loved. That was called They Both Die at the End, that somebody told me about at Quills. It was a really fun read. I just started a book that I don't know if I love yet, but a lot of people are talking about it, called The Three-Body Problem. It was a award winner that is been on my list, so I finally got it from the library. And you can find me at terraluft.com. I'm barely on any social media, so you can find all the places you might glimpse me a little bit if you start at my website, but that's really where you can find all my books. I have an author page on Amazon.
Cool. Bryan.
So as far as my current reading, I just finished Star Wars Princess and the Scoundrel, which was the wedding of Han and Leia and their honeymoon and stuff, which was a lot of fun. I'm reading the newest Battletech book, Redemption Rights. Not the newest, the one that came out that happens at the same time as my book, but in a different part of the universe, just because I got to keep up on the Ilk-Clan era and know all the details. I'm also in the middle of a book of Emily Dickinson poetry. And I have Ravel, Cass's novella on my to read pile right after that, after those.
Nice. That's awesome.
And And
I'm
people can
very
find me.
defending you.
People can find me at swankmatron.com or on Twitter at swankmatron. If they want signed copies of any of my books, they can do it at swankmatron.com.
Also, Brian, what's next on your docket in terms of publishing things?
Oh man,
That
how
you
long do
can
we
share?
have? No, I've got some books out on submission that look very promising. I literally just sent in pitches this week for 4 new Battletech things. So there's definitely a lot of Battletech going on, and that's in addition to the stuff Stackpole and I are working on together. I have a Shadowrun novella coming out sometime before the end of the year. I believe all my Fox Patrol stories from Shrapnel might be collected soon. So there'll be an easier way to get a hold of those. I'm just publishing a ton of short stories right now. I've had a bunch of anthologies come out with some short stories in them recently. I've got 2 books coming out next month, both in the Big Bang Theory universe. So I wrote the Big Bang Theory Book of Lists, which is basically a big catalog of all the most interesting trivia, timelines, assorted things that I wrote for the Big Bang Theory TV show. And there's another one that's sort of like an essay. It's a mini book about the word Bazinga. And it comes with a little button that you press and says Bazinga. So those both come out in September.
Yeah, I was actually just recommending your list book to one of my students who's obsessed with Big Bang Theory. And I'm like, hey, actually. And I was telling them about your process. So anyway, yeah, I'm Alex J. Lore. You can find me online at Alex J. Lore. I am currently working on edits for a book that's loosely Queer Agent Carter in 1946 Dresden. And I am actually about to read a book that was recommended to me at Quill's called August Kitco and the Mechas from Outer Space, which is, again, like, I love Pacific Rim and Battletech. Like, giant mechs are like a thing I'm here for. And apparently this kind of weds this idea of like, what if these giant mechs came to Earth, but the person that has to kind of save the universe is a concert pianist who is just like, hello, I am really good at playing the piano. So I'm kind of really hoping that this book will be like Ridiculous Mechs meets Eurovision Song Contest, but I don't know what's going to happen yet. But KB Wagers recommended it to me, and it's by Alex J. White, who is a delightful person. I like their work a lot. But yeah, that's what I'm currently reading. But also, I wanted to make an announcement before we're done for tonight that the next community book club will feature this year's Diamond Quill Award winner from the 2022 Quills, which is Lynn Worthen's Street Magic, which we will be reading and discussing on September 30th. So this will be on the same link. So if you enjoyed tonight's discussion, like, please come back next month. And I'm really excited to see everybody there. Thanks all for making time for being here tonight. Thanks our panelists and Brian for letting us dissect your book and talk about process. This was a really good time. Thanks all.
Thank you all, and thank you for having me on this.
Yeah.
It was